Let's start with the woke right question, because I love this topic because it's essentially, I see it as the front line of the mimetic civil war going on the right, right? You have like the pro-Israel right, to say it kind of vaguely, who say that the woke right are people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, because they engage in historical revisionism. They question whether the United States are the good guys in World War II, all that stuff. And then on the more anti-Israel right, you have, people like Tucker Carlson and all that, who say that the real woke right are people like, Douglas Murray, or more recently Pam Bondi, who talks about hate speech, who's adopting sort of woke tactics. Douglas Murray accusing Dave Smith of being anti-Semitic in his debate with on Joe Rogan, where Dave Smith brought up Paul Wolfowitz, and Douglas Murray was saying, "Oh, you're kind of weird for doing that. You're kind of weird for doing that." So, how do you see the whole woke right discourse, and more broadly, kind of the split in the right and the future of the movement?
Well, the woke right meme, it means a lot of different things. I think that conservatives, the last couple of years, they were really united and united a lot of different people under anti-woke. So being woke was the worst thing you could be. And so now everyone kind of wants to call their opponents woke because you can get the high ground. When you see Pam Bondi, when they talk about hate speech, sometimes they use the exact kind of same words as the wokes did. They'll say words are violence. I mean, you've seen that stuff. You've seen some of that stuff with the reaction to the Charlie Kirk killing. You've seen people saying, "Oh, you can't, go around saying free speech is one thing, but hate speech is another." I mean, the exact same words that the leftists did. You'll hear it, during, when the tariffs were more in the news. People forgotten about it a little bit. Trump has walked a lot of it back, but around Liberation Day, you would hear these, kind of economic theories, and people were calling it mega Maoism that gathered for a while. So the future of the right, it's going to be dominated, I think, by these internet kind of social media forces. I think it's moving towards an identitarian direction. I think it's moving towards a more kind of populist direction. And so woke just kind of seems like an epithet that they sling at each other as we get there.
That's fair. So I guess, do you think the future of, so you think like the Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson strain of right-wing thought is going to be the ascendant?
Yeah, it's not my philosophy. It's something that I don't like. But I believe so, yes. I mean, if you look at kind of the influencers who are getting most attention, I was just looking for an article I'm writing on Spotify. You look at the top 10 news podcasts, and they're like, Tucker was number one when I looked. Number two was New York Times. Three was Candace Owens. Right. So these are the two of the top three. It doesn't even include Rogan, who's kind of identified with the right, although he's walked away from them a little bit recently. It doesn't even include Rogan, who's number one overall in the country. They don't put him in the news category. And then I look at the influence, and then Megyn Kelly is also in the top 10. Charlie Kirk Show is in the top 10. Ben Shapiro, I think Ben Shapiro was kind of grandfathered in, is probably, not the kind of person who's going to rise to prominence today. But he's been around for 15 years or whatever it is. And so he still's got a popular podcast. But everyone who's rising up, everyone who's kind of getting attention now, is a kind of some form of populist, some form of white identitarian, some kind of, or just like kind of a MAGA cultist, but, Trump won't be with us forever. So I think this is where we're kind of going in the next 5 to 10 years.
Obviously immigration is like a flashpoint topic. And I know you've talked about, I think I read one of your articles and you said something like, if you're a restrictionist on immigration, you're like a moral dunce or something like that. You're very pro.
I don't think I want to put it exactly like that. No, I think that, my argument for immigration restrictionists, what I've been stressing is that there is, you still have to deal in the world of facts. So, for example, during the Trump campaign, they were running on the idea that immigrants were causing a huge crime wave, which just isn't true. I mean, I did a long article where I looked in the data, and people who are immigrants have lower crime rates, and they're likely to be victims of crimes because they often go to the inner city. So it's just not true. And then you have things like the economic arguments, which you think for the most part are not very good. You could still be against immigration. I mean, but it has to be, I think, a more honest take, and a more honest take is just we don't like people who are, we don't want people to settle here who are culturally or racially distant. And I think that's the honest argument, and I think that's what's driving it. And I think a lot of the other stuff is just like you have to pretend like they're committing major crimes when that's just individuals commit crimes. But as far as like immigrants are the reason we have like a high murder rate in American inner cities, it's just not true.
Sure. Do you think there's validity? I mean, like, I would say I'm restrictionist on immigration. I mean, my dark centrist policy prescription would be mass amnesty for everyone who's already made it across the border and who's here, and then a moratorium on immigration. That would be my radical dark centrist compromise. But I'm sympathetic to the idea of being restrictionist on immigration, at least in the abstract. There's certain principles that we can just establish as, okay, this makes sense. Like, for example, not wanting people who are so distant from you culturally is a fair reason to be against immigration, right? Like if someone, the extreme example everyone goes to is, the Sharia law Muslims who believe that women should be, dressed head to toe in a niqab. Like it's I wouldn't say, you can call it bigotry, you can call it racism, but me saying I don't want to live in a neighborhood where 50% of the population believes it's wrong to have women go outside without that, that's a valid moral intuition. You'd agree, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a lot of things where like you don't have to like other people in the country or like their cultural practices. Like the division, a lot of people on the right and a lot of people on the left think that people on the other side of the political spectrum are crazy and have nothing values. A lot of conservatives don't want to live around people who take their kids to drag queen story hour, and so they don't want to live by them. So they move to other communities or they don't move there, and that's fine. And then the immigration thing, yeah, I think there's. I think that could be a perspective. That could be a legitimate perspective. I don't know. I think that trying to have a national identity at kind of like the national level, it's a bit late for that. I mean, you're already stuck with white people on the right and the left who kind of really really dislike each other. The immigrants aren't even that distant from one another when you compare to like the most right wing white people and the most left wing white people. But I think also in these things you have to just take like the costs like seriously, right? Like you have to understand that high skilled immigration is a big deal. I mean, the fact that getting the kind of the smartest, most productive people in the world to the most productive countries in the world is just a huge benefit. So you can look at like the U.S. The U.S. Economic growth over the last few decades, kind of the percentage of people who are immigrant background who founded like our top companies. It's absolutely massive. It's you look at like $1 billion companies, it's like 50% had like an immigrant founder, and so it's like a huge cost, right? And I think that like these aren't like masses and masses of people, the highest skilled people, but there's some people and they will change the culture a bit. But you have to take all this into account. You can't just like put that aside and then if people, I'm not going to say people's feelings are wrong. If people want the country to be all white just because they like looking at white people and they don't like looking at other people, like I'll even say that's an argument. But you have to kind of make that argument to people and then balance it against other things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm against the idea that America is a white nation. Fundamentally, is just wrong. I mean, you just go outside and look; it's definitely not a white nation. And yeah, so the thing that makes it unique is that it's not based on a genetic identity; it's based on a mimetic identity, right? And the whole point of assimilation is immigrants come here and assimilate to that mimetic identity, and then they're just as American as anyone else. But the assimilation thing is key. And I guess when people talk about, obviously, there are people say like preserving the character of the country or preserving the character of the identity. People say, oh, that's a dog whistle for, keeping the country white or whatnot. And I'm sure there absolutely are people who believe that and say it explicitly. But I think the majority of people who are sympathetic to immigration, more restrictionist stances believe in sort of preserving the character of the country, as in like preserving the mimetic character, in that like, it would be good if people came here, spoke English, for example. Like if I move, again, I think of everything of moving into a neighborhood and what's the majority of the neighborhood. It's like, well, if most of the people don't even speak English, well then that's the bare minimum to have a high trust society. And so, when you have illegal immigration, when you have a lot of people just coming over the border who can't even speak, basic English, which I live in Texas and I have friends who live in Minnesota who have noticed the same thing where it's like you can't even communicate with person at the grocery store. It's like that does seem to deteriorate the sense of identity and cohesion in a nation. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, you could have, English language tests. I think that in the long run, though, if you look at kind of the second generation of the people who come to America, it wasn't always like this. I mean, people sometimes I've seen on Twitter say, oh, 100 years ago, there was more demands for assimilation. No, assimilation works much faster today than it did 100 years ago because people here are speaking English. The people in foreign countries are speaking English. I mean, you go abroad and you see people are watching American shows and movies and paying attention to American politics. So the English thing, I don't think that the language thing is a barrier beyond the first generation. And so, you have to show data on that. I mean, I think the data is that basically people who come from overseas, their children speak English, and they're in many ways assimilated to, American culture. I think, in fact, you could look at Hispanics and how they vote. I mean, people thought this was going to be a separatist kind of community. Pat Buchanan, I read his books, in like the 2000s or 1990s. He was talking about Hispanics would come to the country and they would, break off and want to form their own, their own separate enclave in like the Southwest. I mean, that didn't happen. I mean, the Hispanics came to the country and a lot of them now vote Republican and, they're culturally assimilated. They speak English into the second and third generation. So yeah, you have to kind of you have to get at what people's concerns are and then see if those concerns are actually true. And you have to kind of look at data and just kind of observe what's been going on to know that.
That's fair. Would you say, what is your general philosophy on border policy and open borders? Because Trump always talks about the radical left. They want open borders, and people say he's exaggerating, but you more or less want open borders, right? Like you at least you want to remove as many restrictions on immigration as possible.
Open borders, it's kind of it's a philosophical question because we're not anywhere close to getting there. I do think immigration to the U.S. has been working out well. I mean, I have different kind of ideas and priorities. So I prioritize first the high skilled immigration just because, the talent has to get to the best place where it can make the most use of itself. MIT, Caltech, you look at these engineering programs. I mean, they're overwhelmingly foreigners. And of course, as it should be, because like Americans are not getting, Americans are a minority of the world population. If you just get the smartest people, a lot of them are going to be from overseas. And so that's what I prioritize. I would prioritize keeping high-skilled immigration where it is and then increasing it a bit. I do think the low-skilled immigration, though, does have a positive impact. I think the illegal aspect of it really gets people, and I think you do have to take public opinion into account, and you do have to kind of you do have to be conservative in kind of the Burkean small c sense. So going to full open borders, no. I mean, I think that given where we are now, we could probably use more immigration of all types. Yeah, I mean, theoretical of what's the numbers should be. I don't know. If one day we got to the point where I started seeing real problems that people talk about and kind of saw it in the data and saw just from kind of observing what was happening to the country. Once we got there, I mean, it's an empirical question.
Okay, so Yanis Varoufakis talks about, he says the former finance minister of Greece, who's a big kind of left-wing influencer now, says, I view borders as a sign of failure of the human species. We should have open borders, free-flowing good, free flow of people. That is not a philosophical worldview that you share, or you do share it, you just think we have to get there incrementally.
A failure of the human species. No, I mean, I think it was a historical necessity. And maybe I mean, and I'm open to the idea, maybe it's going to continue to be a historical necessity and maybe not. I'm open to the ideas we could start to tiptoe our way there. I think in Europe, they have a lot of Middle Eastern and Muslim migration. I think the problems there are larger and more obvious. I mean, I think that probably opening borders would be probably not the best idea, or kind of something you want to be very careful with in Europe. But no, I mean, that's too kind of pie in the sky for me. I'm more pragmatic. If you tell me we need something that's never existed before, I'm going to be kind of doubtful of that. And that's, a world without borders. But I do see the appeal of it. I do see kind of the moral sense of why should the place you were born, determine, so much about the course of your life and what you're allowed to do. There's power in that idea. It's a very simple, but still,
well, the archetype of the cosmopolitan world, I mean, that's like Star Wars, the Galactic Senate. You have all these different alien races coming together and forming a government. It's like that's a compelling, powerful archetype psychologically. Sure. Yeah. The question is, to what degree, like you talked about, people on the right and left are culturally distinct enough where it doesn't really seem to make sense to say, well, if people are from Somalia or whatever, that's also a distinct cultural difference. And I don't know. I don't think
Somalia is an extreme case, right? I'd say Mexico or something. It would probably be, yeah. But you're right. There are
sure,
extreme
yeah,
cases in Somalia where I would say probably more distant from American conservatives and liberals and each other.
Yeah, the Somalia one is recent because Mayor Jacob Fry in Minneapolis did the ad in Somalian, and that ruffled some people's feathers. Which I mean, I'm sympathetic to. It's just like Spanish, white, black, and Hispanics, and Native Americans. It's like have been here since the founding of the country. It's like, but then if people if politicians are doing political advertisements in Somalian, that does feel like now we've there's a big distance between the original kind of mimetic character of the country to where it is now, and I think that's a valid moral intuition for people to have, but it's not. But again, it's not really racial so much, because if you're Somalian and you speak English, when it's like then that it's not creating that friction. That's kind of on the front of people's minds. Okay, I want to ask you about the post-liberal right, the idea of a dictator and a monarchy. This is something that I've been more interested in over the past few months, of at least just understanding the arguments. So people like Curtis Yarvin's a weirdo. I'll just say that up front, and he says many things that are nuts. And so there's a particular, I think, strain of people who like some of what he has to say about the cathedral and the structure of power and all that. And so Yarvin's weirdness aside, the idea of America needs a monarch or a centralized executive, to be able to usher in the kind of reforms that are necessary. The arguments that those people make are that the monarch that they're talking about is someone like an FDR or a Teddy Roosevelt, where FDR, with the New Deal kind of trampled over the Constitution, the enumerated powers clause. And there's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt that, after he introduced all these agencies and the national parks and all that stuff, said something like, I don't give a I'm paraphrasing, but it's not, it's more Old English the way he says it, but he says something like, I don't give a rap, I don't give a shit about the claim that people said, or the claim that I was usurping my power. Not only was it a good thing, I think it's a great precedent to set moving forward. And so when the post-liberal right, people kind of bring that up and say, well, we want a monarch, and our model is someone who many left-wingers like, FDR and Teddy Roosevelt. A, do you think that's a historically accurate claim to say that these people govern like monarchs? And B, do you think there's validity to that underlying point to begin with?
So there is, a history of kind of the executive branch gaining more power as time goes on in the United States, and presidents have been getting more and more powerful. In the 19th century, they weren't, very powerful. Wilson, Roosevelt, both Roosevelts, LBJ. There's been a kind of extension of executive power over time, and so whether that is a good thing or not, it's a very, very kind of complicated question. Right. It is kind of, I think it's very, very hard to divorce it from kind of the monarch that you're talking about. Obviously, you get a good king and a bad king. You can have more kind of variation in outcomes with kind of something closer to a dictatorship, right? So a really good authoritarian leader can do really, really good things. A bad authoritarian leader is going to do much worse things, and you're probably better off with some kind of system with checks and balances. And so, it's hard to say as a general matter. I think that democracy's historical record is pretty good. The Industrial Revolution took off in Great Britain. It took off in lowland countries in Europe. The places that were relatively more democratic had faster growth and more individual freedom. There are individual cases of dictatorships doing very well. They tend to be really small and historically very unique places, like in the modern world. So Singapore and the Gulf Arab states, amazingly run. That's kind of the best case scenario. if you have an authoritarian leader. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of dictators over time, and the results have been more bad than good. I mean, they've been more on the bad side, like Saddam Hussein or Mao Zedong or something. That's been a lot more common than leaders of UAE or Lee Kuan Yew or someone like that. So every case, I mean, you have to look at like every kind of case individually. I think that something like Bukele in El Salvador, I've written about their problems with crime. This was a serious problem. I mean, this was an emergency. The kind of the murder rate was just off the charts. You couldn't live a normal life. So in case like that, maybe the guy needs to seize power. He needs to bust some heads, and he needs to maybe throw away constitutional niceties. And so it really does depend on the situation in the United States. I don't know. It really does depend on who we're talking about. And I think Donald Trump doesn't really have great ideas. I mean, I think Trump is kind of in a lot of ways, unusually corrupt, unusually kind of unrestrained by the rule of law or like considerations for the public good. So in that case, I think it's probably not a great thing. But a different leader came along who like understood kind of what the problems were. I think in a rational way. Maybe that would be something else. I do think that the left will have to learn from the Trump administration, because they were kind of the people and the abundance people. They talk about this and they kind of get at this. The left kind of lost interest in making the government work well. You have these things like environmental review. It's like impossible. If you're a big government person and you like government, it's kind of a problem that it's like impossible to fire a federal employee, right? I mean, so it's like you want things to get done and you have to go through all this paperwork to do anything. The left has let that kind of proliferate and has kind of let government get broken. And then Trump cuts along and he just like fires, everyone he can. And in that case, it's like people are like, wait, a lot of these people weren't doing anything that great anyway, right? Although there is some things that I think the federal government, where they went too far on, and the federal government should be doing. So I think the left is going to have to kind of take this and realize, maybe I am coming around to this idea that there needs to be more leadership from the president. I mean, the last president they had, I mean, was kind of, senile, as everyone saw at the end. Trump is, corrupt and has all his problems. I'm open to the idea that, like, yeah, the executive does need to be to take a more hands-on role and move the country in a better direction.
Yeah, because I remember, I mean, I think this was in Trump's first term, the idea of the unitary executive theory, this boogeyman concept. And, people were calling Trump fascist for wanting to aggregate all the authority of the executive branch under a single executive. And to me, that's an example of, well, you lost all the goodwill calling Trump a fascist for something that, is a perfectly reasonable perspective to have, which is the single executive should have enough centralized power over the executive branch, not over the legislative or over the judicial, but certainly over the executive branch. And it's just an example of him getting called a fascist inappropriately, to the point now when he does do things that are fascistic, like deporting people for criticizing Israel or throwing people over to the Salvadorian prisons and stuff, then people don't respond well. And I don't know, do you agree that was a mistake on their part, or was the left actually sniffing out the true aspects of fascism ahead of time, and were we wrong to dismiss them?
I think they saw something in this man. So I think that a lot of the people like saw Trump come along in like 2015, and they were like, this is going to be bad. Now, what Trump did, he came into office and he appointed a bunch of like establishment people, right? He appointed like a bunch of generals, and he had, the Congress he had to work with that was like mainstream Republicans, and he was kind of restrained. Now, when he leaves office, he tries to stay in office. He has, he encourages them, or kind of, riles them up to go run to the Capitol and try to overturn the results of the election. And I think in that case, like, even a lot of Republicans were like, okay, this guy is, kind of, maybe they had a point. And then, in the next couple of years, he kind of maintains his hold on the Republican base, just because the Republican base genuinely loves this man, and they don't care about any of that stuff. And the next administration, he comes in and he's basically being the person he wanted to be in the first administration, right? So I do think that they were getting at something right when it came to Trump. Now, at the same time, like, we can say, the left did go crazy. I mean, the left was kind of over the top in its censorship, pressuring the social media companies during COVID. I think they shut down a lot of debate, and they, kept the schools closed for too long, and were hysterical in a lot of ways. At the same time, they did, I think, get Trump. Like maybe they were wrong. People will say stuff like, oh, they called Mitt Romney a fascist. I don't know how many people called Mitt Romney a fascist. Probably not that many. I mean, compared to how many called people Trump. But there is just a part of them that was like always kind of hysterical and just anti-conservative ideas or kind of conservative cultural signifiers. And so like that got kind of turbocharged. At the same time, I think like as far as like Trump as a person, and I think it wasn't just the left who saw this, but like a lot of people like National Review had a never Trump. JD Vance at the time, I mean in 2016 was saying Trump is American Hitler, something like American Hitler. And so yeah, it wasn't just kind of the left. A lot of people on the right saw this too. I think generally they've been vindicated on that.
Well,
I'll say he hasn't been Hitler, but like the idea that like he has like fascistic tendencies and like he doesn't care about democracy and the rule of law. I think that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, well, and I think that like the cracking down on free speech is the most clear form of, the fascism in the thing we don't like is fascism kind of vein. But again, him wanting to centralize authority under the executive branch, he was being called fascist for that.
I mean, some of that stuff is fine. Yeah, some of that stuff is fine. Now, some of the stuff, like he wants to centralize authority because he wants to be more corrupt. Like he wants to go after his enemies. So he just recently fired a district attorney because they wouldn't prosecute Comey. The guy who Trump himself appointed said there's not enough evidence here. So Trump fires him and like gets the woman in there and then basically tells her, tells Pam Bondi, I want to go after my enemies. Like that's kind of stuff he wants to do, which like you've gotten away from like the unitary executive. And now it's like he wants the unitary executive so he can go after his enemies and like nobody can investigate his corruption. And this is kind of the issue. This is the kind of the issue with Trump specifically.
I do not follow the I call it the play-by-play of who's prosecuting who as much. Not that it's not relevant. So I don't have a Republican commentator here to give the other side of the argument, but obviously they would say that Biden went after Trump and tried to get him off the ballot and all that. And I remember there was a Bill Maher episode with, I think her name's Mary Catherine Ham or something, who was pointing out that the Democrats were violating every norm ahead of time to get Trump off the ballot. So what do you think of the claim that the Democrats also participated in prosecuting or going after their political opponents using law?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a few things here. There's like the substantive aspect of what a person did. When someone's prosecuted, you want to see what actually they're accused of and whether there's evidence that they committed a crime. And then there's like the way you do it, right? So first of all, just focusing on, before you get to the substance, the way you do it, Trump is basically saying, prosecute my enemies. Okay, he's basically going to the attorney general. He's saying, I'm going to appoint you. Okay, you don't want to prosecute them. I'm firing you, and then you're going to do something else. But the way that it worked under the Biden administration was completely different. It was Jack Smith, independent counsel. Now you say, well, Biden appointed him, but Biden couldn't force him to do anything at that point. Biden, it was Merrick Garland in the Justice Department did this. There was also a special prosecutor for the Hunter Biden thing, and you can read that book by Jake Tapper and the other guy, Alex Thompson, I think his name is, from Axios, where they talk about basically when they were going after Hunter, Biden's son. Biden was really, really pissed, but did not do anything. He could have technically gone and fired all those people. He could have stopped his son from being prosecuted. Now, he did pardon him like on the last day in office or whatever. That's true.
Yeah, he gave a lot of pardons, right? Including Fauci and Schiff and all that. That was exactly suspicious, I would say. Kind of odd.
Yes, and he got a lot of criticism for that, and kind of rightfully so. But at the same time, the entire administration up to that point, I mean, and Trump, never gets Don Jr. It's never getting to the point where Trump has to pardon him. I mean, there's just, he'll fire whoever is going to be investigating his kids. So that's part of it. Part of it is like you have an independent system under the executive branch, an independent DOJ, which will like be subject to pressure, but sometimes go against the president. Like if he's corrupt enough, they're going to go after him. Trump, no. Trump is like every single person is just picked. He's picking them off TV. He's going to Fox News and saying which person like loves me the most, and I'm just going to appoint them, and he's going to fire them. And he goes through people. Like there was a story that even the Comey prosecution, Todd Blanche, who was Trump made him number 2 in the Justice Department. This guy was Trump's personal lawyer. Trump makes him number 2 in the Justice Department. He's the guy who he personally talks to Ghislaine Maxwell. They sent Ghislaine Maxwell to a medium security prison from like a maximum security or whatever she was. Apparently, they got something they wanted. But even he is like kind of, according to news reports, warning him about the Comey prosecution. And so Trump has like his other personal lawyer, this woman who is a beauty queen. He puts her in, like his other lawyers, the other cronies who he appointed are like, oh my God, this is too far. So It's just like differently, like how it's done, right? And this is relating to like what actually the underlying charges are. So there have been, and I think the strongest case against Trump was probably the classified documents. He took the classified documents back. Now, like that happens a lot. And then what they do is they will go to them and they will say, whatever the National Archives in this case, they will go to the former leader and they will say, we want our documents back. And usually they just give them the documents back. It's a crime they took it, but like if you just cooperate, usually you're not going to be prosecuted. Trump was basically caught on tape telling people to go hide the documents. He was caught on audio basically talking to some journalists and like waving like, here was the plan to attack Iran. Like it's classified. You're not supposed to see. It's like a literal audio recording of him doing this. So they got him, I think, for the obstruction of justice, which is like if you don't cooperate and you just like give the middle finger to them. Biden had a similar case. Biden actually cooperated. He had some classified documents too.
Yeah, right. Wasn't that the Durham report or whatever?
Yeah.
And they said he was too old.
Yeah,
but I thought the statement was he was too old and senile to be prosecuted. Essentially, that's why Durham didn't bring the charges.
It was like that, exactly. So, and by the way, this was a special prosecutor under the Biden administration. Like this guy was allowed to do the work and get to that point, right? Trump, forget.
Sure.
So we're dealing with like a different kind of reality here.
Yeah,
and then like he did actually try to overturn the election in 2020. I don't know if that some people are still like unaware of like the actual facts behind this. So that's a bit of it too. So you're right. So there are there are always political prosecutions. It's a matter of degrees. It's a matter of like maintaining some form of norms, and Trump is just way beyond all of that.
Sure, that's fair. Part of the reason I don't pay as much attention to it is like the degree to which I don't necessarily have influence over it. Not that I have influence in any greater capacity, but I do think talking about like the post-liberal right, the post-Trump era, that like the long-term trajectory of things is more, I guess, fruitful for someone in my position.
I mean, people have different focuses. I think that though it can kind of, because people make a lot of claims, right? And so a lot of times when you say, look at the crazy thing Trump did, they'll say, well, look at this thing that happened during Biden administration or under Obama. And then, you're forced to kind of get into the facts a little bit and say whether it's the same or not. I wrote an article for people who are interested in for Unheard about it was a review of the Biden book. So just Google my name, Unheard, UNHERD, Biden, Jake Tapper, or whatever. You'll find it. And I go into this in some detail on the differences between Trump and prosecutions of Trump and kind of what was going on during the Biden administration.
That's fair. I want to talk about Israel. One of the again, using blunt tools here, I would put you more on the pro-Israel side of things. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair.
The thing that I do not see discussed as often as I think it should be discussed on the pro-Israel side of things is this whole topic of Jewish supremacy, which is what Norman Finkelstein calls it. And because I think the conversation usually goes like, well, what can Israel do to bring about peace? Other than defeat Hamas, what else can we do? Because if we put down our arms, they're just going to want to wipe us out. And the fact that sort of anchors, my perspective on this is the existence of someone like Ben-Gvir, right? Ben-Gvir, who had, I don't know if you're familiar, he had a shrine to Baruch Goldstein in his living room, right? The mass shooter who shot up, I think he killed like 30 women and children at a Palestinian mosque. And the Minister of National Security, Ben-Gvir, who was the Minister of National Security for the majority of the October 7th war, had a shrine to this guy in his living room. That it's like the equivalent of if the Department of Homeland Security had a shrine to like Dylan Roof, while at the same times we had like black people in a literal apartheid state with, in an occupied territory with no voting rights, in the actual government proper. And so if I'm a Palestinian, to me it's obvious that if someone like this is in charge of, a lot of the settlement policy in the West Bank and all that, or settlement security, of course you can't make peace with Israel if someone like this is in charge. And so I guess my question is, how do you view the problem of like the Jewish supremacist element within Israel? Do you think it's a problem? And what should be done about it?
Yeah, there are certainly people within Israel, sometimes very powerful people, who just want to dominate the Palestinians, and they're not interested in kind of human rights or any of the ideals that Americans and Westerners care about. Now, the thing is, you can also look at Palestinian society, and you can look at kind of Hamas, and you can look at those crowds who were cheering, those kidnapped people on October 7th, and you could say, well, that's kind of these kind of terrible, kind of fascistic, genocidal ideas are just as strong or probably stronger on the other side. And so there are kind of elements on both sides that are terrible. I would argue that in the case of Israel, there is closer to democratic values than Palestinian society is. I think if you look at the kind of polling and what kind of solution they ultimately want to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, I mean, I think you would see that. I mean, you see wide-scale opposition to like the Netanyahu government within Israel. Some people say he keeps the war going in order to in order to not have to face another election or anything. Yeah, I think that's something people say, but at the same time, there isn't really a lot of pushback to Hamas within Gaza because they're a totalitarian regime that wipes out any kind of dissent. And so this is true. You can make criticisms of Israeli society and people who are in positions of power. I still think Israel is still a society and a civilization that is worth preserving, and it still has a lot that's good and redeemable and benefits the world.
Would you say the same about Palestine?
Frankly, I mean, like in the current state, like no, I mean benefits to the world, not as much. Certainly, I mean you just look at kind of innovation that's coming out of Israel, scientific progress, and it's not just Palestine. I mean, you could look at kind of the Arab world. I think that they're in a kind of a different state of civilizational development. And so, if you're looking at a lot of the things that a lot of medical technologies, you'll hear about them coming out of Israel pretty regularly. You won't hear about it from the Arab world. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't have any rights or something like that. But I do think that the world basically benefits from Israeli civilization, just like it benefits from Western civilization in a way that it doesn't from Arab countries. Now, Arab countries have succeeded in some places. I mean, they've been UAE, some of these places where they've gone beyond kind of these, this attachment to the land, the religious fundamentalism, and have tried to be pragmatic and have a kind of open attitude towards the world. I don't see Palestinian society like going in that direction. I mean, hopefully, I would hope they would one day get there. But it's at this point in time, and I mean, I think Israel is the civilization that is more worth preserving at this point than what the Palestinians have, which isn't all that much.
I mean, I don't think. I mean, sure, you can make the economic arguments about like technology coming out of Israel more, but I don't think that's the measure by which we should say a culture gets preserved or whatnot. I mean,
I think it's a moral thing too. I mean, I think that the fact that the people live in greater freedom than the people do under Hamas. I mean, Hamas is an oppressive regime. Palestinians who live under Israel have more rights of free speech than Palestinians who live under Hamas. So even if you care about like stuff like individual liberties,
but compared to like the United States, they have almost no rights. I mean, the people living in the Palestinians living in the West Bank it is an apartheid state, it is an occupation, right? There's no dispute about that.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that.
Right, and so again, the question is on the issue of Jewish supremacy, because Benny Morris, in his interview with Coleman Hughes a couple of years ago, pointed out like the religious right in Israel is rapidly outbreeding, having more kids than the secular left, and so the country is just demographically moving more and more right, and people like Ben Gvir are gaining more and more power. And again, like the fact that I agree the comparison is to Hamas, like the bloodthirsty jihadists. It's like, yes, that element exists within Israel as well. And to me, the conversation on the pro-Israel side is so absent acknowledging this part of the equation. The people who are, saying, let Gaza, the blood, the streets overflow with blood and whatnot, and clear them out and, wipe them out. It's just like, it seems to me that if the pro-Israel side wants to make its case, it needs to directly address the subtler movement and the Jewish supremacists, but they just kind of hand wave it away and say, "Oh, it's not as bad as Hamas." So, what action, if you were advising, the Israeli government, what should be done about the Israeli like, should they just be outright taken out, like in terms of forced out of the settlements, like removed from the areas in the West Bank? I've said that, a U.S. foreign policy should be, we cut off aid to Israel unless they remove the settlers. We give them a 30-day ultimatum and say, remove the settlers or remove this amount of settlers, or we're cutting off this aid, to put pressure on them, to give the left-wing Israelis some leverage here to say, yes, now's the time to get rid of these settlers. Because I don't see that issue resolving, and at all.
Well, I mean, look, I think that some of the changes in Israeli society over the last few decades have been a kind of as a result of the failure of the peace process with the Palestinians. So I think the Second Intifada, a lot of Israelis saw that is they tried to give peace a chance. They had that Oslo Accords and all that. And then Bill Clinton at the very end was working towards a solution. And his attitude came to be that he couldn't get the Palestinians to agree to a deal. And that was 25 years ago. Since then, we had Hamas. We had Israel leave Gaza, and then we had Hamas come to power there. And so a lot of it is, the Palestinians are having a reaction to the Israelis and what the Israelis are doing, but the Israelis are also having a major reaction to what the Palestinians are doing. And that's kind of been the dynamic for several decades.
Right, but even with the Second Intifada, like Baruch Goldstein's shooting at the mosque was in 1994, which preceded the Second Intifada. There's people that point out that was one of the major causes that eventually led up to the Second Intifada.
Yeah, I mean, the Israelis are a divided society. I mean, Rabin, worked out peace with his opponents, and then he was assassinated, right? I mean,
right. By people who are currently by people who are sympathizers of that, and those people are in the coalition government in Israel. So again, it's just
And so, I mean, that's a difficult question because you keep going back and say, well, this happened. And then
to the degree that Israel is the one that has the agency here. Because like Hamas, yes, they're rabid dogs, let's just say. There's nothing that, Hamas should do this. Well, we don't have, assume that we can't affect their agency because they're just complete jihadists off the rails, which is what many Israelis would claim. And perhaps that's, entirely true. But Israel does have agency. And so the question is, given the agency that Israel does have, what can be done about the settlers and the sort of Jewish supremacy movement there?
Well, the idea so there are other people who have, agency. I mean, Hamas, we probably don't have as much direct pressure over them, but I think we can have pressure on the other Arab states. And I think that the idea that the Palestinians should be basically leaving as refugees, because look, even if the war ends tomorrow and they get rebuilding, it's destroyed. I mean, Gaza is destroyed, right? So it's going to take generations to rebuild. Let those people settle somewhere else. I mean, there's been talk of the Trump administration doing that, and every other conflict in the world where there are people in vulnerable conditions, we say it's a good thing if they could become refugees and go somewhere. With the Palestinian issue, people are more hesitant to accept that idea. I think that's a mistake. I think we should look at it like we do other conflicts. I do think I think giving Palestinians the right to leave is kind of the best thing for Palestinians. I mean, before I saw a poll that even before the war in Gaza in previous years, basically, if you ask young Palestinians, do you want to leave to the what? Do you want to leave to the West? I think it was the West, or do you want to leave somewhere? 50-60% of them wanted to leave before there was a war, right? People don't want to live in third world countries. I mean, people don't want to live under these conditions. So I do think that trying to, resettle them. I mean, Syrians, millions of Syrians left. Some of them came back, in this case, probably they wouldn't be coming back, but still, I mean, they would move on like millions of people across the world have. They've moved to a new country and they've gone on with their lives. I don't think there's a good solution here in the sense that they could move out of the West. They could leave the West Bank. There could be attacks from the West Bank. They're going to want to go back in after that. I mean, if the Gaza thing is not settled, that's still going to be an issue. So, it's not just Israel can just turn one switch or do one thing, and then it's going to have peace with Palestinians. This is still going to be a conflict. And I think that basically the path of getting them to be refugees is, I think, the long-term solution to this, rather than, going back and forth or hoping to work out some peace deal.
Does that include the West Bank? Do you think the Palestinians should then leave the West Bank as well?
Look, I mean, if you gave the West Bank people a right to go, you gave them enough money and you told them you could go somewhere to start a life, I think a huge portion of them would take it, even without a war or anything like that. If it would settle the dispute and it would give these people a good life, then fine. The numbers would go down, and then you could say, well, Israel, now you're not threatened. Now we can go to Israel. We could say, you're not threatened anymore. Now it's an easy question. You have these people who are just these deranged people who just want to, eliminate all Palestinians. They have no strength now, because you could say, you're wrong. They're a small minority. There's no more war going on. Then I think you could really pressure Israel. You could change the internal dynamics of Israeli society. And so, I mean, these things are all kind of they're kind of all intertwined with one another, right? One thing influences everything else.
Right. Well, and like I just don't see. I mean, you could. I'd have to see more polls and data suggesting that the Palestinians would be willing to leave. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is in Jerusalem. The October 7th attack was called Al-Aqsa Flood. So there's clearly a deep religious component and attachment to the land on the Palestinian side. I don't think they'd be willing to leave as frictionless as you're suggesting. But again, it seems to me that we're just essentially saying we can't do anything about the Jewish supremacists. They're going to get what they want, and we should just allow it. When the narrative I'm being told, maybe I'm wrong, is that there's so many people in Israel who oppose the settlements, who oppose the Jewish supremacists, that it actually could be stopped, and we could, in the United States, use our influence to help, push that agenda forward. But it sounds like you're saying, well, really, and this is your assessment of the situation, fair enough, that things are bad enough where we basically have to allow the Ben-Gvirs and people to just get what they want because it's more difficult to fight, to push back against them than it is to remove all the Palestinians from Gaza and presumably eventually then the West Bank, because that seems to be the direction it's moving.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's certain that the U.S. could get. We try the aid thing and we try to pressure countries, and sometimes it backfires, and sometimes they do the exact opposite of what we want them to do. So, like, I'm not sure that like we have that power or it would actually be productive. Maybe we can, but then at the same time, like if Israeli security, if we get them to do, I don't know, XYZ, remove some settlements for the West Bank, it's going to be a big political risk. I mean, this is what happened with when Sharon pulled out of Gaza, right? They do it, and then oh my God, there's an attack from Gaza. All right, we're gonna have a war, right? If something happens in the West Bank and there's like an attack or something, you're going to be right back where you started. Those people are going to be right back having the power and the influence they have before. So it doesn't solve anything. I mean, the underlying security condition, creates the situation where the people you call Jewish supremacists or the far right or whatever you want to call it, I mean, they're getting kind of nectar. They're powered by the fact that there is a conflict, and that the problem is,
Correct.
We don't have a straight.
That's why they propped up Hamas for so long. That's why Bezalel Smotrich said Hamas is an asset, precisely because of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know, like how I think this kind of thing that they propped up Hamas, I think is a little bit exaggerated, because they did get the money to Hamas. They were the government that was kind of elected, and so it's kind of a complicated story. But like, you can't, it is primarily a question of like internal dynamics in Palestinian society that led to this. Whether like some Israelis here and there, help them. I don't think they are like the dominant force determining, like kind of that made Hamas come to power in Gaza.
You could be correct on that. I don't know the details of it. Like you pointed out, it's a very complicated thing. I'd be very curious to hear the opposition side of that, because there's people who point out that Israel's assassinations of, I forget what the more moderate, is it Fatah is the more moderate party?
Yeah, but those moderates were also like, like supporting suicide bombers and stuff. So it was, those moderates weren't like all,
Well, I'd be curious to know what the pro-Palestinian side would say to something like that. But I mean, I agree with you. Everything is very complicated. There are no easy answers, but it just from a psychological point of view, I don't see how you could ever sate the Palestinian desire for some sense of justice, because genuine injustices have been, inflicted upon them, just as the same with Israeli society by Hamas. And I just don't see how you can sate that without holding to account the people who, have shrines of mass shooters who then took, are like the third largest party in Israel, because the religious Zionists merged with the Jewish Power Party and are in coalition government with Likud. And it just seems to me that the United States, at minimum, should not be supporting that at all, especially if the demographics seem to continue to point in the direction of them gaining more and more power.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea whether you can like kind of sate their anger, I mean, throughout history, like groups have suffered and kind of moved on. So a lot of Middle Eastern Christians were chased out of their countries. I mean, they moved on and they didn't think about it, and they went and they started new lives in Latin America or America or Western Europe. You do have, like after World War II. I mean, it was terrible what happened to a lot of the Germans after the war, but Germany was a peaceful state after that. It didn't sit around and say, it was kind of a stricken with guilt. It didn't even it didn't try to get revenge on the people who persecuted them. And so, yeah, these are cultural things. I mean, there is a kind of historical, there are historical memories, but sometimes people do move on when the politics get settled, right? And so, like, one of the best ways for them to move on is to like actually get out of that environment and get somewhere else. Otherwise, it's always going to be about the Palestinian cause. So look, you can go back and you can say, well, Israeli society did this and Palestinians did this, and there's this element or there's that element. Like, what is the I like to think of it more in terms of what is the most straightforward path to protecting the Palestinian people, making their lives better, ending the war, because the war is everything. The war is what radicalizes, the conflict itself is what radicalizes people on all sides. I would love, two-state solution. You're here, we're here, and we both have freedom and we trade and we're good friends. That's not going to happen. I don't think there's any realistic prospect of that. And if I'm right that there's no realistic prospect of like a two-state solution, like there's no way that happens within the next 20 years or something, kind of what is the solution? The Palestinians stay there for 5, 6, 7 more generations until something good happens? No, I think we should be thinking in terms of population transfers, which has worked throughout history and which has kind of ended conflicts. This is just one of those cases where I think we're going to need that because there's no other solution I see on the horizon.
It's what Hitler said about the Jews.
Well, I mean, but there's people who said it that it also worked out too. I mean, the Middle Eastern Christians left, or a lot of Armenians left their country. I mean, people left and they move on, right? It happens throughout history. It's not the best thing, but it's like, it's not ideal, but it happens.
Yeah, sorry, not to. Well, 50 minutes in is a long enough delay to accuse someone's belief of being Hitler. Right?
It took long enough to get.
Yeah, that's fair. Just to finish this off, where do you think the Palestinians should go? What do you think is the best? I mean, I saw there was like a Trump administration plans to move them to, was it Tunisia or something, or
I've seen proposals for all different kinds of places. I mean, look, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that many people. I mean, 2.5 million. Now you look at Turkey. I think Turkey from the Syrian civil war, just Turkey alone, not the rest of the world, I think had something like 5 million or 6 million Syrians at one point, right? So that's just Turkey, right? So
yeah, but that caused a lot. It's caused a lot of problems. Certainly in Europe, right? Isn't most of the immigration the result of the Syrian civil war?
Some of it is, yeah. I don't know about most, but look, you have 2.5 million people. I think that like what the world should do, sometimes refugees come to a country and they're poor and that causes problems. Just take whatever money you would have spent on, supporting Israel or whatever. Take whatever money, this thing is costing the world, right? Because like the back and forth with Iran and like the Houthis, firing at ships, like take whatever like money you can and like make sure that like wherever the Palestinians go, they have like they're living well. They're just like living great, and they can contribute to the economy. They're infusing money wherever they go, whether it's the Middle East or whether it's Europe or whether it's America, right? It is something where like if you put as much priority on like just making the Palestinians' lives better and getting them somewhere as you do towards like all the energy that's gone into the conflict, it's been a waste because the conflict has just gotten more violent and hasn't been solved. You could figure this out. This isn't like an intractable problem. It could even be, it could be a developing world country. I mean, let them have villas in the Philippines or something like that. I mean, you need creative thinking here. This is something that I think the Trump administration was pretty good at. I think with the Middle East policy, the first administration with Jared Kushner, I think that's something that they could do again potentially.
It is one of the reasons I certainly have felt a greater allure towards nihilism. Is because we are at the point where we're now just rationalizing ethnic cleansing.
Well, look, I mean,
it's not that bad.
I mean, but there's so many countries in the world. Look, there's so many, there's like, genocides, there's murders, there's wars going on, a lot of different places, right? So this is a particularly bad one, but
this is a strange tangent, I suppose, with the whole post-World War II consensus idea. But it's like, we're basically modern morality is oriented around like Hitler is evil, the Holocaust is the greatest, terrible atrocity in humanity. It feels like, and it's like, well, now we're so the whole orienting morality was Hitler is evil and the Holocaust was bad and all, what he did was just like pure evil. And now we're talking about, well, Hitler trying to expel the Jews from Germany might actually have been a perfectly reasonable policy because they were not. It's just like,
well, I mean, well, but no, but what we do.
So
say
it's disorienting now because, like, sure, there's a part of me that thinks you are correct in that maybe the thing that does minimize the amount of death and suffering is because Israel's not giving up and they're clearly stronger. So this is kind of a might makes right scenario where, yeah, the Palestinians just have to leave, and that genuinely would be the solution in the long term that reduces death. But then as soon as I agree that, it's like, okay, well now if the strong people are in power and they want to ethnically cleanse an area, then I have to say, okay, that could be right, and maybe then genocide is acceptable in certain contexts and all that. And so it just I'm not criticizing you. I'm sort of thinking, I'm just speaking out loud of the sense of like, all of my orienting morals get very challenged by all these things, which is, maybe a me problem and no one else's, but.
Well, I mean, yeah, just to go with that analogy, I mean, you look at how we look at World War II and what happened under Nazi Germany, we still look back and say, well, FDR should have let in more Jews. I mean, we don't look fondly on the people who kept Jews out and wouldn't let them to flee Nazi Germany when they wanted to, right? So this is itself as kind of another lesson from history. We can condemn Hitler, and we can also say, well, you should all, if we want to say Israel's Hitler, which I don't think is fair, but like even if we did say that, we still say, people leaving would generally be a good thing rather than them being left in this difficult situation where they're subject to human rights abuses and atrocities.
That's fair. I have a final question for you. Who is worse? Nick Fuentes, Destiny, or Hasan Piker?
Oh, Hasan Piker. I don't know much about Hasan Piker. I read his op-ed in the New York Times, but there are things. Fuentes is, I should say, I'm not that familiar with him. From what I've heard, from the clips I've seen, I'm not a big fan. Fuentes
of Hasan or Fuentes. Okay.
Piker, yeah. I mean, Fuentes is funny. I mean, I have to give him that. He's a funny guy, and so I do have to give him that. And then Destiny, he says some bombastic things, but when I talk to him, he's relatively sensible. So yeah, from what I know about the three, I'd say Piker.
That's fair. Maybe I should use that as the intro clip. Who's the worst, Hasan, Destiny, or Nick Fuentes? All right, we're coming up on an hour. Is there any topics you wanted to? What is something that you would want to be asked at a time like this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
it's one of them lame ChatGPT questions.
Yeah.
But
ChatGPT questions. Yeah, I don't know. I could talk about whatever I want. Kind of, I have my own Substack and my own Twitter, so I can write whatever I want. So when people ask me that, I'm usually just like, no, I'm here for you. Whatever you want to ask me, fine. If there's something I really want to talk about, you'll see it on my timeline or you see it on the Substack.
I have talked to Stephen Wolfe, who's the author of Case for Christian Nationalism, and then Dave Green, the distributist, and then actually someone else named Jay Shapiro, who I admire. He's sort of he's like a left-wing kind of anti-Zionist. Would you be interested in talking to to these people sort of on the post-liberal right at all? Do you know who Stephen Wolfe is?
I don't. I think I know who Dave Green.
Dave Green, the distributist, yeah.
Possibly. I'd have to look into their work. I mean, if it's the debate thing, I don't like the debate format. I like a conversation.
Richard, I hate debates. In fact, all of my worst moments in YouTube history are debates. So I'm specifically against them. But and the most interesting conversations are where two intellectual people like disagree on something and can hash it out in a calm setting. But okay, so as long as it's not a debate, you might be open to it.
I have to kind of.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.